Hi, Nutrition 111 students. Today we are looking at Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 focuses on designing a healthy eating pattern. Essentially, what is a healthy diet? What are the guidelines? What are the reference points? How do we describe a healthy diet? Well, let's get started with that. We use the term variety to describe a healthy diet. A healthy diet is varied. You choose foods from all of the food groups, and that's important because you're more likely to meet your nutrient needs. You'll see as we move through this course that different food groups are rich in different nutrients. Balance is another word used to describe a healthy diet. Of course, a healthy diet is balanced in terms of calories. It provides the calories that you need, but it's also balanced in terms of proportionality. It provides more nutrient-dense foods and fewer foods that are high in fat and sugar, cholesterol, salt, and alcohol. Let's talk a little bit about nutrient density. Dietitians spend a lot of time encouraging their clients to choose nutrient-dense foods. Nutrient-dense foods provide a lot of nutrients in the calories they provide. Generally speaking, we can look at this little image here and see that the fat-free milk is nutrient-dense compared to that soft drink. The fat-free milk provides a lot of different nutrients, the soft drink, none. There are also different ways to use nutrient density. There's a calculation that can be done. You can use it specifically for one nutrient as well. But I think more importantly is the general outlook, in that what we should be encouraging is that people push toward foods that are higher in nutrients and lower in, again, sugar and salt and unhealthy fats and alcohol. And you can see that in this these examples here. As you move from one to the other, you're moving toward nutrient density, and that will bring, of course, more nutrients and fewer of those substances that we need to moderate. And that's another word that is used to describe a healthy diet. Moderation means keeping a cap on, not getting too much of the substances that increase our risk for chronic disease. So essentially, we talk a lot about portion size, and we will today as well. Energy density is almost the flip side of nutrient density, but not quite. Energy density is the calories per weight of a food. And what researchers have found is that if you choose low energy dense foods, you have an easier time managing your weight, because those foods, such as this lunch at the bottom, have more bulk. They typically have more fiber, more fluid, and less of that sugar, salt, sodium, etc. So this shows you the very low energy dense foods moving up to the high energy dense foods. The book that uses this concept throughout is Volumetrics, written by the researchers who did research to find that just teaching people to choose lower energy dense foods enabled them to manage their weight. Okay, as far as guidelines, probably the set of guidelines we talk the most about are the dietary guidelines. They come out every 5 years, and they're guidelines that are meant to keep Americans healthy, primarily focus on diet, but activity is covered as well, physical activity. Your textbook covers the 2015 dietary guidelines. The 2020 dietary guidelines have been released. So we're going to take a look at those, and you'll be responsible for them. What is fortunate for you, but a little disappointing for me, is the fact that they're very, very similar. And let me tell you a story about dietary guidelines so you understand perhaps their strengths and their weaknesses. Every 5 years, a committee of experts in nutrition is brought together to review the recent research and then make recommendations for these guidelines. And they put together a big old committee report. Now, when the final dietary guidelines are issued, they don't quite match the committee report of the experts. And that's because after that committee report is given back to the government, the lobbyists, the food industry gets involved. So we always see a little bit of weakening. Okay, so this time around, the expert committee wanted to drop added sugar down to 6% of calories, wanted to drop moderation in alcohol for men to 1 instead of 2 drinks. And as it has the last few editions, wanted to sound a bit of an alarm around overconsumption of red meat because of its connection with some health problems, including cancer. And that did not happen because the food industry got involved. Now, I am not saying the dietary guidelines are bad. They're very solid guidelines. People like me are always a little bit disappointed that they don't go further. But nonetheless, you can find them here. And there are some shorter summaries and consumer pages that might be helpful. What we're going to do right now is watch this video. But before I do, I need to stop my share and then make sure that you can see and hear the video. So here we go. So good, right? There's a lot to be happy about there. The attention to the entire lifespan, certainly the attention to culture and budget, good, solid advice for sure. But again, a couple of these we fell a little bit short of what the dietary guidelines recommended. Right now, I want to do a little bit of math with you because I think that this will be helpful for you when you get to the exam. So let's look at what we've got here as far as numbers. Added sugars are supposed to be less than 10% of calories starting at age 2. Saturated fat, the same, less than 10% of calories. And sodium, less than 2,300 milligrams. And there we are with alcohol, 2 per day for men, 1 per day for women. Okay, so we're going to play a little bit with these numbers, but hold on one second because we need to switch our screens around. Okay. All right, because I want to show you something here. And this also will be helpful for the test. Okay. This is the All Daily Reports report that you saved after your 3-day food entry for the diet analysis project, okay? NCP is how I refer to it, Nutrition Calc Plus. So I want to mention a few things about sugar and also saturated fat, and then we're going to do some math, all right? So you've got your profile information. This is for Monique, the recommendations, and then you've got this nice bar graph, and you're going to use this a lot. This bar graph, the value column is your intake. The DRI column is your recommendation, and the percent bar is the percent of that recommendation that your intake met. All right, so you can see clearly here that Monique was short on calories, 68%. All right, so I want to show you something with regards to sugars. The total sugars data in this program includes both natural and added, so it doesn't help us much for the questions that I ask on the Nutrition Applied to. All right, you're going to have to look at the specific foods and whether they appear to be high in sugar rather than using this. But we do have saturated fat here, and I do want to write down these numbers for our math. So we've got Monique consumed 24 grams, and she consumed 1579 kcals. All right. So this math is not something you should skip over, and that's why we are practicing it. So we're going to use the whiteboard here. All right. So let me see, I guess that is that. All right. So let's start with the sugar. Let's say Monique consumed, I don't know if you can see this, but 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, which has 65 grams of sugar, added sugar, 65 grams of added sugar in each bottle. All right, that's 130 total from the Coke. And then let's say another 10 in the rest of her foods. So that's 140 grams of added sugar. All right, now we're going to be looking at the percentage of calories from the added sugar, because that should be less than 10. So we need to convert grams to calories. And we learned how to do that last unit. Sugar is pure carbohydrate. So it's 140 grams times 4. And that would be 4 kcals per gram. All right. Equals, and I should be able to do this in my head, but I'm just checking because I don't want to, 140 times 4, 560 calories from added sugar. Now we need to get to that less than 10% guideline, right? So now I'm going to divide 560 kcals from added sugar, all right, divided by what? 1579 total kcals. And that's going to give us the magic number. So we'll go 560 divided by 1579. Oh my goodness. 35, whoops, sorry about that, 0.035 or 35%. So, oh my goodness, like many Americans, Monique is getting much too much added sugar. Let's check out that saturated fat because we have to do that math a little bit differently. 24 grams saturated fat times 9, right? Kcals per gram for fat. So for fat, we multiply times 9. Okay, let's see what we get here. 24 times 9. That means 216 kcals came from saturated fat. To come up with the percentage of the total, same thing again, 216 divided by 1579. And we get 0.14 if we round, or 14%. All right. Doesn't meet the goal either. Now, I don't want to make you dizzy, but I'm going to show you one more thing. All right, so I have to change and go back into this, and I'm on my screen, not my whiteboard, so we should be where we should be. Okay, so I want to show you that a neat report on here. There is a macronutrient distribution report and a total calories chart that will save you some work for certain things, not for the sugar. But if we look here, we can see saturated fat, okay, gave 216 calories, and that was 14% of the total calories. So that's how we calculated it. We got the right answer for that, okay? All right, so back to our slideshow. Now, another guide for us is the Choose My Plate food group plan. And you can see here that it gives you an image as well as some numbers when you dig into the website. And you'll be going to the website for your homework. So there are 5 food groups. Fruits and vegetables should be about half of your plate. Most of your plate should be covered by plant foods. You can see that clearly. And that dairy is next to the plate to show you that you need to include that group as well. This plan is individualized depending on your calorie need. I'd like you to memorize the amounts for the 2000 calorie diet, and that will be helpful for some test questions. It also gives us a kind of general idea of what's recommended for a healthy diet. I will tell you this though, even though we quite often mention 2000 calories as the average calorie need, people differ so much in their calorie needs. A small, inactive, older person might need 1400 calories. A taller, younger, more active person might need much more than 3200 calories. Okay, now what we see when we look at Americans is they're not consuming enough dairy, enough vegetables, enough fruits. And by the way, we are consuming too much of what are called the empty calories, which provide the added sugars and the unhealthy fat and the alcohol. One of the problems, but not the only one, is that food portions have exploded. One of the ways that you can keep that in check or help your clients keep that in check is by using these common objects to indicate what a portion is. So you can see here, half a small bagel is about the size of a hockey puck. You can see that 3 ounces of meat, poultry, or fish is about the size of a deck of cards. And that can be helpful because what's happened over the past 50 years or so is that the portions of foods have grown exponentially. And the problem with this is that we tend to eat with our eyes, not with our stomach. Research has shown this. So if we're given bigger portions, we tend to eat more. And you can clearly see that here. There are some strategies that we can use to kind of fight back or to suggest to our clients things like using a smaller plate, things like ordering the small size when you're out. But this impact of large portions adds up to a lot more calories, and those extra calories can cause health problems. This is a campaign out of New York City's public health department. And I think it was rough and kind of bold, but it also clearly made the point that it's not just getting more for your money. It's not just a bigger portion size. This extra can lead to very serious health problems. Now, when we look at dietary guidelines, there are different people that make recommendations in different ways. We have talked about Michael Pollan. He says dietitians tend to make nutrition far too confusing, and his advice is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. But again, he clearly distinguishes what is food and what's an edible food-like substance. Marion Nessel out of NYU, she is an author as well, and by the way, has a great blog called Food Politics. I like hers. She says eat less, move more, eat fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and avoid too much junk food. And remember, when we're talking about nutrition, it's easy to get caught up in the latest kind of news article on the latest superfood. But we, in the dietary guidelines as well, are trying to focus more on dietary patterns. You may have noticed in the video, they mentioned an 85 and 15%, trying to get 85% of your calories from very nutrient-dense foods, and that little sliver can be for the extras, the things that aren't quite as healthy. The dietary patterns that do this best bring excellent health outcomes. They tend to be plant-based and limit those unhealthy substances like sugars and added salts and red meat and unhealthy fats. The Mediterranean diet is not the only healthy pattern. The Nordic diet has good research behind it. The vegetarian diet has good research behind it. The Japanese, traditional Japanese diet, there are many for sure, but they tend to have some things in common, like the plant-based aspect of them. You will be looking at this in your nutrition applied homework, so I won't say too much, but this is another pattern that's recommended for healthy eating that differs significantly from the Choose My Plate. Okay, so on to a different type of recommendation, and these are the dietary reference intakes, and they are numbers for specific nutrients. So dietary reference intakes are recommendations that cross many different people. They are assigned in gender and age groups. We started with the recommended dietary allowances, but now we have more DRIs. And here they are. We will be focusing on the recommended dietary allowance, which is your recommendation for a nutrient. How much iron do I need? The tolerable upper intake level, which is the level at which toxicity might occur. How much is too much? and the AMDR, which your textbook doesn't say a lot about, but I will say a few words about. So you can read more about this, focus on the RDA, the UL, the daily value we'll talk about with its connection to food labels. Okay, so this is an important graph, and I want to explain it, and I'll make this point over and over again because it's an important one. The RDA is your 100%, okay, your recommendation, your DRI on your all reports report, okay? That's your goal, that RDA. And it covers the needs of most of the population, and some, as you can see clearly here, can get away with less and be healthy. But this is a very safe level, and for all nutrients, a good bit below the UL. So I'm going to make a point here that's very important. Exceeding the RDA is not toxic. Many nutrients have a very wide margin of safety. Some of them don't even have a UL. Some of them have a little more narrow UL. But the point is, 150% is not too much. This area is all in the safe zone, okay? All in the safe zone. You can go over the recommendation without harm until you hit the UL. And that UL differs for different nutrients. Okay, and I'll keep repeating that. The second really important point here, and I will repeat this one as well. It goes nicely after that last chart. Too little and too much can be problematic. We just mentioned that for most nutrients. There are some that don't have a too much. They all have a too little. When you don't get enough, however, you don't instantly become deficient, all right? It takes time to get there. Differs. For water, for instance, a couple of days can take an effect. You can suffer from dehydration, even one day for an athlete, for instance. But for other nutrients, that can be weeks, months, and even years. Okay, there's a decline in body function, a decline in stores, and then finally clinical symptoms. All right, so I mentioned that I was going to talk about the AMDR. You'll be looking at these with your homework. What are they? These are the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. And what they tell you is what part of your calories should come from each of the energy yielding nutrients, carb, fat, and protein. What percent of all of your calories should come from carbohydrate, from fat, from protein? And what you can see is it's a pretty wide range. Now, your textbook doesn't focus a whole lot on this, and I get what the authors are doing. Increasingly, we're finding that there are individuals and there are cases where being outside of that range is perfectly okay, all right? We will notice lower carbohydrate intakes for some individuals following a low-carb diet, and there's some good research for that diet for specific health issues. Some people feel better on a bit more protein. But I think the AMDRs are still important because they at least raise a red flag so we can be aware that things seem to be a bit out of balance and look into it and make sure that everything is okay. So we will be using them. Food labels, all right? This is another place we can learn about food, and it can help us design a healthy diet. So I want to mention a few things here. First of all, the ingredients in a food label are listed in descending order of weight, meaning that the first ingredient weighs in the heaviest, then the next, then the next. That's helpful sometimes. If you see sugar in the first or second, you know that that's a pretty high sugar product. The serving sizes, are they recommendations? They tend to be kind of an appropriate serving. It might act as a check when you want to eat perhaps an inappropriate amount. And it's also important to notice that if you have 2 pouches, then you have to certainly do the math and multiply everything by 2. All right. Percent daily value. Those are these percentages. This shows you how that one serving fits into a full day's intake, recommended intake. So some of these recommendations are limits and some of them are goals. But you can see here that this 1 pouch of macaroni and cheese gave you 11% of the fat that you should consume as a limit in a day, 13% of the saturated fat, only 3% of the fiber. Something that's helpful with these percentages is the 5 and 20 rule. If you remember that 5 is low in fiber, and 20 is high, kind of high in sodium. All right. This is the new nutrition label, which you'll read about in your textbook. There were changes in terms of serving size, the calories being in larger type, and some updated daily values, as well as the vitamins and minerals that are highlighted because we tend not to be getting enough of them. All right, so let's look at this real quickly. This is Luigi's manicotti and Mario's manicotti. If we hold them side by side, we can see a huge difference in terms of the total fat and the saturated fat and the sodium, by the way. So this would be helpful, right? We may want to give this one a try and see if it seems to be healthier, lower in calories. Check out the taste as well. Okay, so lastly, your chapter covers nutritional assessment using the ABCDEs. Be sure to go over this. I love nutritional assessment. It was my favorite part of being a clinical dietitian. I think I'm investigative, so I enjoyed gathering all of these pieces of the puzzle. We can't make a complete assessment without all of them. And I'm going to give an example in just 1 minute that you may see as a test question. So anthropometrics are physical measurements. Remember that. You'll see that on the test. Very important in an assessment. And so are labs, biochemical assessment. We look at things like blood sodium and hemoglobin and hemocrat. We look at albumin levels, the list goes, potassium, the list goes on and on. Clinical assessment is your appearance, the gait, things like hair loss, sense of touch. And dietary assessment is what you're doing for your project, but gathering information so you can assess that typical food intake and compare it to recommendations for that individual. And of course, we need to remember all of the things, the social determinants that have an impact on an individual's nutritional status, because to not take them into account would be very short-sighted. We wouldn't be able to develop appropriate strategies. So ability to shop and cook, transport the shopping, living conditions, budget, etc. Okay, so I want to mention something here that becomes part of a test question, and I also want you to understand it for your project. If you find that let me do this. I want to show you something. Okay. All right, so let's look at Monique. Okay, we're going to look at the bar graph. Monique's iron is very low for these 3 days. Can I say that Monique has an iron deficiency? Absolutely not. It's 3 days, it's data. We don't know how accurate it is, and it certainly can't diagnose a deficiency. What we can say is that iron intake is inadequate for these 3 days. If I was working with Monique, I would look at her. I might look at the linings of her eye. I might look at her nail beds, ask her about her energy level, ask her to get some blood work, look at the iron indicators in that blood work. So there are many more pieces of the puzzle that need to be brought together in order to make an assessment. Okay, so that is it for the chapter 2. Take care.